Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 103 The Queen is Dead. Quick content warning up front. While most of this is just politics, there is mention of some violence and even suicide towards the end of the episode. I've attempted to keep it mostly to the facts, but if that is something that concerns you, just please be aware. The year is 628. And the mood in the inner chambers of the palace is somber. The court is no stranger to illness. After all, when the Oomi Soga no Umako had grown ill, 1,000 individuals had entered religion to pray for his recovery. He'd recovered from that, indeed, only to pass away 2 years ago. His son, Soga no Emishi, had taken his place at court and at the head of the powerful Soga family. This time, though, it's different. The sovereign, Kashikaya Hime's illness, affects the entire court. After more than 30 years of her rulership, it seems that the great queen of Yamato will not recover this time. A handful of maids and selected members of the royal family are called into the inner chambers of the palace, tending to her in her final moments. The mood is tense, not just because of the impending death, but also because of the uncertainty for the future. After all, the crown prince, Umayado, had passed away approximately 6 years earlier, and nobody has been named his replacement. Kashikiya Hime's own son, Prince Takeda, had passed away some time earlier and is already buried. Now the inner circle wonders if she will name her successor, or will she pass on without doing so, leaving the throne empty and setting up yet another bloody power struggle like the ones at the end of the reign of Nunakara Futodamashiki, aka Bidatsu Tenno. Many people still remember what had happened then. They'd possibly even lived through it, recalling the Soga and Mononobe raising up armies, the fighting across the land, and the accusations and repercussions that followed, and forced many on the losing side into hiding. And they know there are several candidates waiting in the wings. For example, there's Prince Tamura, son of Prince Hikobito, who had been slain in the succession disputes that eventually ended up putting Kashikiya Hime on the throne. That made him a grandson of Nunakura Futodamashiki no Ookimi and his first wife, Hirohime. His mother is the royal princess, Nukade, daughter of Tachibana no Ookimi and sister to Prince Umayado, aka Shotoku Taishi, giving him a full royal pedigree to draw from. There's also Prince Yamashiro, the eldest son of that same Prince Umayado and of Tojiko no Iratsume, one of the daughters of the late Soga no Umako, the powerful Oomi who'd raised up the Soga family. Umayado's fame is well known as the saintly Shotoku Taishi, the previous crown prince. He's known to be close to the queen, Kashikiya Hime, and there's not a little bit of speculation as to whether or not she will name him to take up his father's mantle. He has, after all, succeeded his father in his own household, living in his father's palace at Ikaruga near the family temple of Horyuji. Both candidates, Prince Tamura and Prince Yamashiro, are called to Kashikiya Hime's bedside, and there she gives each of them instructions as to what to do upon her demise. Not too long after that, Kashikiya Hime passes away. The queen is dead. Long live the... well, who exactly? Alright, so we've been covering Yamato during the reign of Kashikiya Hime from 593 right up to 628. And what a reign it has been. The Soga family had married into the royal line, and then, with the death of Nunakura Futodamashiki, placed the princes of Soga descent on the throne. And if you want to go back and listen to all that, then probably go back to about episode 90 or so. During this period, we've seen the building of Buddhist temples, at least 46 we're told, and we see Yamato explicitly adopting certain concepts of statecraft and kingship from across the continent. I say explicitly because there are certain things, like the Uji and Bei system of clans and the accompanying Kabane ranking system, that appear to have come over as well, but the chroniclers never really acknowledge that, treating it as though they were just always a thing. We see the rise of the Sui and transition over to the Tang dynasty on the continent, and Shilla continues to expand and solidify their control on the peninsula. We are now towards the end of the reign, As noted before, Prince Umayado, aka Prince Jo Tokutaishi, passed away in 622, and after he died, no other crown prince appears to have been selected. Umayado was one of the three people seen as holding the reins of state at this time, with the other two being Kashikiya Hime, of course, and her uncle, Sogono Umako. There are some who even suggest that Sogono Umako, as Omi, was actually in control and Kashikiya Hime was simply a puppet figure. That seems to be countered by something that happened about 623 or 624, 2 years after Umayado passed away, when Sogono Umako sent Azumi no Muraji and Abe no Omi no Maro to Kashikiya Hime to request that he be given the district of Katsuraki, as that's where he was from and where he took his name. Now, beyond the fact that this gives us some insight into the origins of the Soga family, or at least the origins they claimed for themselves, it's interesting for us now because of Kashikiya Hime's response. She first noted her close ties to her Soga uncle and went on to say that under normal circumstances, she would do anything she could to fulfill his requests. But in this case, it was a little bit too much, even for her. If she said yes and gave him and the Soga family the entire district of Katsuraki, then what would future generations say about her? Now, it's difficult to say if this actually happened or if it was part of what appears to be a smear campaign against the Soga family, who, spoiler alert, would eventually be accused of trying to usurp the power of even the sovereigns themselves. That said, it seems like the kind of thing that is just plausible, though possibly using a bit more justification to back up the request. Still, the chroniclers at least were providing agency to Kashikiya Hime. Sogono Umako, who had been the Oomi for some time, would pass away a few years later. That year, we're told that peach and plum trees blossomed, and that the third month of the year, probably late March or April, it was particularly cold and a hoarfrost fell across Yamato. 2 months later, Sogono Umako died. He was buried at Momohara, probably at the place known as Ishibutai Kofun. This was a large, square-shaped kofun, but today it has all but worn away so that you can see the giant stones that once made up the internal structure of the tumulus. Unfortunately, this means that any grave goods have long since been taken and any organic material has probably completely disappeared. But it is an amazing tomb to get an idea of what the inside of a 7th century kofun really looks like. Sogono Umako lived in the family mansion on the banks of the Asuka River. We know roughly where it was since Hokoji Temple used part of the Soga land for its own founding, so it would have been right next to Umako's mansion. We also know that it had a water feature, a kind of pond with an island or shima. Sometimes Sogono Umako would be known as Sogono Shima. I suspect that his son, Sogono Emishi, who took up Sogono Umako's post as Oomi, also took up residence there, as the Sendai Kuji Hongi also refers to him as Sogono Shima at one point, though that could just be a mistake of some kind. The next month after Sogono Umako's death was also pretty bad. We are told that snow fell in the 6th month, and there were continual rains from the 3rd to the 7th month. This led to famine, and both the old and young died of starvation or disease. People were eating whatever weeds and herbs they could find, and banditry and thievery increased as people grew more and more desperate. It didn't get any better the next year, which saw more omens and strange reports. Apparently, a badger up in Michinoku, referring to the Tohoku region, turned into a man, possibly a reference to similar stories about tanuki and the belief in other shape-changing animals, but definitely a weird thing to occur, let alone to record. And then there was a huge swarm of flies, we are told, or some kind of insect, that gathered together and flew east over the Shinano Pass. Reports said they were as loud as thunder, and they dispersed when they reached the land of Kamitsukenu. Aston suggests this probably refers to Usui Toge, a pass between modern Yamanashi and Gunma prefectures near Karuizawa. I don't really have any explanation for either event to give you. I mean, I'm sure it meant something to the people back in the time, but looking back now, I suspect they were interpreted as storm clouds on the horizon. And that is because in the 2nd month of 628, Kashikiya Hime took ill. On the 2nd day of the following month, the chronicles record that there was a total eclipse of the sun, and 4 days later, Kashikia Hime took a turn for the worse. By the way, fun fact in this rather morbid narrative, that total eclipse of the sun might just give us a verifiable date here because we can calculate astronomical phenomena like eclipses. In fact, given the impact of the events around this particular one, it has been specifically studied, and you can check out the work of Tanikawa Kiyotaka and Soma Mitsuru titled On the Totality of the Eclipse in AD 628 in the Nihongi, published in 2004 in Publications of the Astronomical Society of Japan. And I'll provide a link in the blog post. TLDR, there was an eclipse on April 10th, 628, and based on the work of Tanikawa and Soma, it was likely visible from the archipelago. There's some question as to whether or not it was a total eclipse when viewed from the Nara Basin, and specifically from the palace at Asuka, and it's even possible that the chroniclers were using continental records to verify the actual dates and conditions, not to mention the way that stories can grow in the telling of them. However, it is likely that they did witness an eclipse of some sort, and this gives us some solid dates for everything else. That means that Kashikia Hime likely took ill in late March of 628, and then her illness took a turn for the worse on the 14th of April, at least according to our modern calendar. And yes, there is some discrepancy in those. We would say that April 14th is the 14th day of the fourth month, not the 6th day of the third. However, we are dealing with the conversion of ancient lunar calendar dates into modern Western solar calendar dates. Even now, just a few days before this episode airs, we just went through the Lunar New Year in much of Asia based on the descendant of that same lunar calendar. That New Year happened February 10th, 2024, but for the lunar calendar, that would be the first day of the first month. And that isn't even going into all the various corrections that both calendars have gone through over the centuries. And don't get me started on Julian versus Gregorian dates or how that affects various lunar festivals that are now tied to a solar calendar. However, I think that putting the date in a modern solar calendar context can help people get a better appreciation of the seasons and what was going on. As Kashikia Hime took ill, spring had sprung in the Nara Basin, and the cherry blossoms were likely in full bloom. And yet, even as that was happening, the mood in the palace was dire. It's fitting, perhaps, because today cherry blossoms, for all their beauty and the fact that they're blooming at a time that life is seemingly returning, are often considered a metaphor for the all too fleeting impermanence of this mortal existence. They blossom in beautiful and spectacular color, but all too quickly they are gone. And so too did it seem that Kashikia Hime's time was coming to a close. She was 75 years old, and she had ruled the realm since 592, about 36 years, not including the time before that she spent as a consort or the 2 short reigns in between. She had been the sovereign over some of the most influential periods of Yamato history, including the spread of Buddhism and the introduction of new continental styles of learning and governance. Now she was on her deathbed. Surrounded by her maids and various royal princes and princesses, she called 2 of those princes in particular to her bedside. Specifically, she called Prince Tamura, and she also called Prince Yamashiro no Oe. As previously noted, they were the 2 most likely candidates for succession. Kashikia Hime provided instructions to each of them in relative privacy, and those appear to have been her last words as she passed away the next day. As was customary, she was temporarily placed in the southern hall of the palace while arrangements were made for her funeral. Preparations for her burial would, however, take some time, and so it was on the 20th day of the 9th month, over 6 months later, that the rites to officially mourn the deceased sovereign were held. A shrine was erected at the southern court of the old palace, which served as her temporary burial place, and each minister pronounced a funeral eulogy. 4 days later, she was buried, in accordance with her wishes, in the tomb of her son, Prince Takeda, who had predeceased her. She had requested this instead of building her own tomb mound to avoid placing a burden on the country given the famine that people had been going through, or so we are told. Traditionally, she is believed to have been buried at Yamada Takatsuka Kofun, aka Takamatsu Kofun, in Yamada, in the Taishicho area of the modern southern Kawachi district in modern Osaka, though some have suggested nearby Ueyama Kofun instead. Both are rectangular kofun rather than the keyhole shaped tombs of previous rulers, but that might make sense if she was buried in the kofun that had been built for her son, who never actually sat the throne. It also may just speak to the changing norms of the time, where keyhole shaped tombs seem to be no longer the done thing. Regardless of where she was buried, her death left a power vacuum, as there was no clearly designated heir to the throne. There were at least two candidates, and we've seen where that has led in the past: warfare and bloodshed. No doubt there was a palpable feeling of anticipation and anxiety around Kashikia Hime's death. Would rival camps start feuding once again over who should sit the throne? Would there be another deadly fight for power? In addition to the existential threat, whoever the new sovereign was that came to power would have a huge effect on the court. They could appoint new families to take the Omi or Omuraji positions, and they would no doubt reward those who supported them in helping to come to the throne. Those on the losing side could find themselves on the political outs, or worse. Soga no Emishi was the most powerful member of the court at the time. He was the current head of the powerful Soga family, the son of Soga no Umako and the Oomi, the most powerful position in the court. He had his own thoughts on who should be sovereign, and if he could have, no doubt he would have simply appointed someone and made it a fait accompli. However, even his power had limits, and he knew that if he put someone on the throne unilaterally, he would likely be opposed by the other ministers, if only because they didn't want to cede him that much power. Therefore, he would need to get them to go along with it. And so, one of the first things he did was to press his uncle, Sakaibe no Marise no Omi, asking him his thoughts about the new sovereign and who it should be. Marise told Emishi that he believed Prince Yamashiro would be the best candidate. Remember, Prince Yamashiro was the son of the crown prince, the late Umayado, aka Shotoku Taishi, and his father had been well respected and deeply involved in all aspects of the government. And Prince Yamashiro had largely taken his place, living as he was in his father's old compound in Ikaruga, where Umayado had erected the temple of Horyuji. On top of that, he was a royal prince of Soga descent, with multiple connections to Soga no Iname, as well as his mother's own descent from Soga no Umako. One might assume that he would have some loyalties to his extended family, the Soga. However, this answer didn't sit so well with Soga no Emishi, who had his own preference for Prince Tamura. Now, Prince Tamura was not so directly a Soga descendant, but rather more directly descended through what some have referred to as the Okinaga line of the royal family. At first glance, it might seem odd that he would support someone from outside of his family, but consider this. If Prince Yamashiro were to take the throne, then he becomes the most powerful Soga descendant. Those with ties to the Soga could easily support him over Soga no Emishi, especially with the addition of royal blood. Often we see that when it comes to family loyalty, the divisions within a family can often be more brutal than external feuds. This is a theme that will echo through the centuries. Prince Tamura, on the other hand, was a relative outsider. If Soga no Emishi helped him to the throne, then Prince Tamura's own power and authority would be thanks to Emishi's work, and at least somewhat dependent upon him and the rest of the powerful Soga family. Furthermore, he was married to Hote no Iratsume, another daughter of Soga no Umako, and thus Soga no Emishi's sister. Soga no Emishi may have felt that this connection to his sister and brother-in-law was better than it was to Prince Yamashiro. I'd also like to note that if Sakaibe no Marise really was Emishi's uncle, that meant he was also a rival for the head of the Soga house, since, as we've seen, inheritance often went to siblings before it made its way down to the next generation. I mention that only to further demonstrate the complicated familial politics of the time, where traditions of inheritance were not strictly laid out. Seeing as how there was not a consensus even within the Soga family, Emishi decided he would need to win people to his side if he wanted to do this thing. And how better to do that than to throw a party. Emishi conspired with Abe no Maru no Omi, and they invited everyone over to Soga Mansion for a feast. Soga no Emishi wined and dined the who's who of the Yamato court. They ate and drank their fill, and by all accounts had a great time, likely putting aside the tensions of everything going on outside. As the party began winding down, Emishi had Abe no Maru broach the subject of succession. And so Abe no Maru addressed the crowd. He started with what was likely on everyone's mind, the fact that the sovereign was dead and there was no clear successor. If they, the ministers of the court, didn't figure out something soon, they were likely to see civil disturbances. So, whom should they agree to succeed her? He then recounted what people had heard during Her Majesty's final wishes. Although the conversations had been held in the relative seclusion of her own private quarters, to which only a handful of people were typically invited, there were still attendants who had been there, and as such, word had leaked out. According to that game of ancient telephone, Kashikiya Hime had called in Prince Tamura and told him that the realm is a great charge, and, of course, not to be lightly spoken of. Be watchful and observant, Prince Tamura, and not remiss. Then to Prince Yamashiro she said, avoid your own brawling speech, and make sure to follow what everyone else has to say. Be self-restrained and not contentious. And so Abe no Maru asked, who should we make the new sovereign? At that point, he was met with an awkward silence. Things had been going great, but Abe no Maru had just committed a party foul and brought up politics. So much for the fun and games. Finally, Otomo no Kujira no Muraji spoke up. Why don't we simply obey Her Majesty's final commands, he suggested. There's no need to go out and seek a general consensus. Challenged by Abe no Maru to expound on this, Kujira continued to explain his thoughts. Since Kashikiya Hime had said to Prince Tamura that the realm was a great charge and he should be not remiss, wasn't it clear that she had made up her mind to hand it over to him? And who were they to say otherwise? At that point, 4 other ministers spoke up. They were Unemi no Omi no Mareshi, Takamuku no Omi no Uma, Nakatomi no Omi no Mike, and Naniwa no Kishi no Musashi. They all agreed with Otomo no Kujira and agreed that they should end discussion, essentially casting their votes for Prince Tamura. However, not everyone agreed with this. On the other side of the aisle were Kose no Omi no Oomaru, Saheki no Muraji no Azumodo, and Ki no Omi no Shiote, who all threw their support behind Prince Yamashiro. That's roughly 5 ministers vocally for Prince Tamura, not including Abe no Maru and Soga no Emishi, but there were at least 3 on the other side as well as Sakaibe no Marise, Emishi's uncle. And there may have been others that are not mentioned. That left one person who hadn't spoken up, Soga no Kuramaru no Omi, aka Soga no Omasa, Soga no Emishi's own brother. He was apparently on the fence about the whole thing and asked for time to think it over. Given all of this debate, it was clear to Soga no Emishi that there was no unanimous decision. At least, nothing that was approaching everyone agreeing on it. If so many of the nobles were on the other side, then a decision risked splitting court and therefore bringing more chaos to the land. Furthermore, a split decision could risk a split in the Soga family itself. And so he retired and sent everyone home from the party. Of course, the court was hardly a place for secrets, and pretty soon Prince Yamashiro got word of the discussions that were taking place. And so he sent a private message to Emishi by way of the royal Prince Mikuni and Sakurai no Omi no Wajiko. He basically asked, dude, what's up? And why would Emishi want to put Prince Tamura on the throne instead of him? This was apparently a bit awkward. Prince Yamashiro was asking Emishi as his uncle, distant though that relationship may have been. Rather than going to Prince Yamashiro to reply in person, Emishi instead gathered a bunch of the ministers who had been at the feast, and he sent them, including members of both the pro-Tamura and pro-Yamashiro factions. At Emishi's direction, they went to Yamashiro's palace at Ikaruga and delivered Emishi's message. Through them, he asked how they should be so rash as to decide the succession all by themselves. All that was done was that Her Majesty's dying commands had been conveyed to the ministers. Then the ministers had said, apparently with one voice, that Prince Tamura was, based on Her Majesty's words, the natural heir to the throne. And were there any objections? This was all the words of the various ministers, not any specific sentiments, though, of Sogono Emishi, who claimed that though he had an opinion, he refrained from communicating it until he could talk with the Prince Yamashiro face to face, which, notably, he hadn't done. And here, by the way, we get an inkling of the way these communiques were happening. Because it wasn't like the ministers just went up to Prince Yamashiro directly. I mean, they went to his mansion, but much like in the palace, they were offered their communications via intermediaries. In this case, they told Prince Mikuni and Sakurai no Omi, who were apparently attending on Prince Yamashiro, and then those two passed the words on to Prince Yamashiro himself. The implication seems to be that should Sogono Emishi have come himself, I suspect they would have talked in private. As it was, the words were then apparently public, which also means that both sides had to choose their words carefully. It also allowed Emishi to have some amount of plausible deniability. And so, after Prince Yamashiro had heard what his intermediaries reported, he asked them to go back out to the ministers and ask exactly what they knew of the dying wishes of Kashikiya Hime. From there, they reported what Sogono Emishi had told them, admitting that none of those present had actually been there at the palace. Rather, the words had been reported to them by the princesses and ladies-in-waiting attendant to Her Majesty, but surely Prince Yamashiro, who had been there himself, already knew all of this. Prince Yamashiro then asked directly if they had heard the actual words, and all of the high ministers there admitted they had no knowledge of the specifics, just what they had heard secondhand. Prince Yamashiro then offered his version of events, which was slightly different than what Sogono Emishi had suggested. On the day that he was summoned, Prince Yamashiro claimed he went to the palace and waited at the gate. He was finally summoned in by Nakatomi no Muraji no Mike, who came out from the forbidden or private quarters, and Prince Yamashiro then proceeded to the inner gate. In the courtyard, he was met by Kurikama no Uneme no Kurome, and led to the great hall where there were tens of people in attendance, including Princess Kurimoto, some 8 ladies-in-waiting, including one named Yakuchi no Uneme no Shibime, and Prince Tamura was also there. Apparently, he had already talked with Her Majesty. Kashikiya Hime herself was lying down in bed, could not see Prince Yamashiro enter, so Princess Kurimoto went to inform her that he had arrived. With that, Kashikiya Hime raised herself up, and according to Yamashiro, gave him the following command. We, with our poor abilities, have long borne the burden of the crown, but now our time is drawing to a close, and it seems we cannot escape this disease. You have always been dear to our heart, and our affection for you has no equal. The great foundation of the state is not a thing of our reign alone, but has always demanded diligence. Though your heart is young, be watchful over your words. Prince Yamashiro then emphasized that everyone who was there, including Prince Tamura, heard and knew what she said, and expressed how he was both full of awe and grief. He leapt for joy as he heard her words, which he understood to be passing on the mantle to him. He did, though, have his concerns. He was, as he tells it, young and inexperienced. He was devoid of wisdom, as Aston translates it. How could he accept a charge to handle the issues with the spirits of the land and of the various ancestral shrines? Those were weighty matters. He wanted to go and converse with his maternal uncle, he said, with Sogono Emishi, and with the various ministers, but there was just no good chance, and so he had kept quiet. But he did remember years ago when he went to visit his sick uncle, and he stayed at the nearby temple of Toyoura, the nunnery built on the site of Kashikiya Hime's palace. At that time, she sent a message via Yakuchi no Shibime, who said that his uncle, the Omi, was constantly worried for him. After the sovereign's death, wouldn't the succession fall to him, Yamashiro? And so he should be watchful and take care of himself. To Prince Yamashiro, the matter seemed clear, but he emphasized that he did not necessarily covet the realm, only declared what he had heard, calling to witness the Kami of heaven and earth. Therefore, he wanted to make sure that he correctly understood Her Majesty's dying words. With that, he praised the ministers for always addressing the sovereign without bias and asked that they go back to his uncle Sogono Emishi and convey what he had told them. Prince Hase, another son of Prince Umayado by another mother, and half-brother to Prince Yamashiro, separately sent for Nakatomi no Muraji and for Kawabe no Omi. He told them both how he and his father, and his brother, came from the Soga family, and that they relied upon it heavily. Therefore, he asked that they not speak lightly of the matter of succession. He then sent for the ministers, including Prince Mikuni and Sakurai no Omi, and emphasized that he wanted to make sure there was an answer back from his uncle. Emishi's reply, sent via his own intermediaries, was that he had previously said all that he had to say and nothing else. However, how should he presume to choose himself between one prince or the other? And I don't know if you can quite feel it, but I can certainly imagine the tension. Sogono Emishi wanted the court to place Prince Tamura on the throne, but clearly Prince Yamashiro thought that Kashikiya Hime meant for him to succeed her. Nobody appears to have fully corroborated either side's telling of the sovereign's last words. In fact, even in the Nihongi, there are several different versions that show up, including a variation at the end of her reign and the variations in the telling of the start of the next. Was Prince Yamashiro remembering or understanding the words correctly? Or were others distorting them for political gain? A few days after the ministers left Ikaruga, Prince Yamashiro sent Sakurai no Omi once again to Sogono Emishi. He again reiterated that he had only reported what he had heard, and that he did not want to go up against his own uncle. However, Sogono Emishi was feeling ill, and was unable to talk with Sakurai no Omi, who presumably left the message with his attendants, and then took off. The next day, feeling in better spirits, Sogono Emishi sent for Sakurai no Omi, Prince Yamashiro's messenger, as well as various ministers to go and carry a message back to Prince Yamashiro. He started by abasing himself, claiming that from the time of Ame Kuniyoshi, aka Kinmei Tenno, until now, the end of the reign of Kashikiya Hime, the ministers had all been wise men. However, he questioned his own rank, stating he had mistakenly held rank above everyone else merely because good men were hard to find. But because of this lack of wisdom, he could not settle the question of succession. That was, of course, a grave matter, and not one to be discussed through intermediaries, despite the fact that he was expressly using intermediaries. And so he agreed, despite the fact that he was of more advanced years, to travel up to Ikaruga to speak directly with Prince Yamashiro so that there would be no misunderstanding of Her Majesty's words. This was totally the case, and not at all because he had any private views. At the same time, Sogono Emishi sent Abe no Omi and Nakatomi no Muraji to his own paternal uncle, Sakaibe no Omi no Marise, and asked him just one more time, which prince shall be made sovereign. Clearly, he was hoping Marise would swing to his side and agree to support Prince Tamura, with the hope that he could therefore cut off any other dissent. Marise answered that he had already given his answer in person, and that he had nothing more that he wanted to say. He then went off in a huff, upset that he was even being asked a second time. He clearly saw the question as an attempt by his nephew to get him to change his answer. Now, as all this was going on, the Soga family was gathering all their clan to construct the tomb for Sogono Umako, perhaps referring to the Kofun known today as Ishibutai. Sogono Umako had passed away some time ago, but perhaps had been buried in a temporary mound, and only now was his final tomb being completed. Marise's job was to tear down the sheds at the tomb, which he apparently did, but then immediately retired to the nearby Soga farmhouse. likely meaning a house out by the rice paddies rather than the main Soga compound, only a slightly further walk away. Once there, Marise refused to do any more work, protesting the way his nephew was treating him. This temper tantrum pissed off Sogono Emishi to no end. He sent to Marise two messengers of Kimi and Obito rank, as opposed to the high minister sent to Prince Yamashiro. A rough translation of the message goes as follows: I know your evil speeches, but by reason of our relationship of elder and younger brother, I cannot injure you. If others are wrong and you are right, I shall oppose them and follow you. But if others are right and you are wrong, I will oppose you and follow them. Then, if you should eventually disagree with me, there will be a breach between us and there will be fighting in the land. If that happens, future generations will say that you and I brought this country to ruin. So be careful and do not allow a rebellious spirit to rise up. Marise, though, was still having none of it, and to add insult to injury, he left to stay at Prince Hase's palace in Ikaruga, basically shacking up with the pro-Yamashiro faction. Sogono Emishi just got more upset over this blatant and public display of loyalty to the Yamashiro cause, and he sent ministers to Prince Yamashiro demanding that they hand over Marise. These messengers made the case that Marise was disobedient to Sogono Emishi, the head of the Soga house, and was hiding in the palace of Prince Hase. Sogono Emishi requested that they hand Marise over so that he could examine why Marise was doing this, though that was likely just a polite reason so that Emishi could lock him up, or worse, until the succession crisis was concluded. Prince Yamashiro answered that Marise had always been a favorite of Her Majesty, and they had only come to Ikaruga for a short visit, nothing political. How could he hope to stand up against Sogono Emishi? And so he asked that no blame come to Marise. At the same time, Prince Yamashiro spoke to Marise and warned him that however touched Yamashiro might have been to have Marise come to seek them out, and despite the gratitude he owed for Prince Umayado, Marise's actions threatened the peace of the realm. The way things were headed, if Marise stayed at Ikaruga, then it would have given a pretense for Sogono Emishi and his supporters to storm the palace and take him by force, likely bringing the political dispute over succession to a head that would break out into actual warfare and martial conflict. Moreover, Prince Yamashiro's father, Prince Umayado, had always told his children to avoid all evil and practice good of every kind, and that had become Prince Yamashiro's constant rule, or so he said. Because of that, although Prince Yamashiro may have had his own private opinions on the matter, he was patient and not angry. He refused to set himself up against his uncle. Therefore, he urged Marise to not be afraid to change his answer in support of Prince Tamura. He should yield to the many and not retire from public life. The various high officials present likewise urged Marise to listen to Prince Yamashiro and do as he suggested. Marise, finding no support for going up against his nephew, Sogono Emishi, finally gave in. He burst out weeping and went home, where he stayed secluded for more than 10 days. During that time, his one supporter, Prince Hase, suddenly took ill and passed away. With Prince Hase dead, Sogono Emishi decided to move against Marise. He raised troops and sent them to Marise's house. Hearing they were coming and knowing he had nowhere left to turn, Marise and his second son Aya sat in chairs outside the gate to their home, waiting for the troops to arrive. When they got there, Mononobe no Ikui was made to strangle them, and they were both buried together. Now Marise's eldest son, Ketsu, had tried to escape this fate. He fled to the worship hall of a nunnery, perhaps Toyota Temple, where he'd had some assignations with a couple of the nuns. However, one of the nuns was apparently jealous and told the troops where he was. They stormed the nunnery, but Ketsu slipped through their grasp and headed to Mount Unebi. The troops searched the mountain thoroughly, and eventually Ketsu found himself hemmed in on all sides, with nowhere left to turn. Rather than be taken and killed by the troops, he decided to take his own life, stabbing himself in the throat. When people heard about all this, they wrote a song. It goes, Unebiyama, kotachi usu kedo, tanomi kamo, ketsu no wakugo no, komoraseri kemu. Which Aston translates as, On Mount Unebi, Though thin are the trees, may there be not some trust in them. The youth Ketsu seems to have hidden there. Following the death of Marise, it seems there were none left that were promoting Prince Yamashiro's accession. Even he seems to have quit arguing for it. Whether or not Sogono Emishi ever came to talk to him is not recorded. Instead, they mention that on the 4th day of the first month of 629, Sogono Emishi and the ministers offered the royal seal to Prince Tamura. Although Prince Tamura initially refused, as appears to have been de rigueur for such things, the ministers persisted. Prince Tamura claimed that it was a weighty matter and that he was wanting in wisdom, and the ministers responded that he was the favorite of Kashikiya Hime and that both the spiritual and physical realms would turn their hearts to him. Therefore, he should continue the royal line, and so later that day he took the throne. He is also known as Jomei Tenno. And so that is the story of the succession crisis that followed the death of Kashikiya Hime and how Tamura, aka Jomei Tenno, came to the throne. Sogono Emishi would continue to exert considerable authority over the throne, and there would be more changes coming to the government and to the state. At the same time, Prince Yamashiro was still out there, meaning that there was at least one other possible claimant to the throne still on the loose. We'll address that in our upcoming episodes. Until then, once again, thank you for listening, and thank you for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/sengokudaimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to tweet at us at Sengoku Podcast or reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for her work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.